Hello, class. The last area that we're going to look at in terms of our self-awareness is focusing on kind of our overall core self-evaluation. And so our core self-evaluation is made up of a couple different attributes that we'll look at, and really looks at our personality as kind of a basis for our core self-evaluation. So our personality, the definition of our personality is the relatively enduring traits that make us unique, right? And so our personality comes from our environment, it comes from our genetic makeup, right? So this combination of those two things that kind of create who we are. As we go through and you kind of analyze your personality and your core self-evaluation, again, we can make changes to our personality. It is very difficult to do that because it's kind of who we are. But if we recognize some of our personality traits aren't something that we like, that we're proud of, again, we can make those adjustments. It just takes a lot of kind of self-determination to do that, but it is possible. One of the assessments that I sometimes have my students do is analyzing kind of your personality through what's known as the Big Five personality traits. So you can see those are up here on the screen. And what this assessment does is each of these personality traits are on a continuum, and you can kind of see where you fall in terms of these areas. The reason why these traits are chosen is because they're closely connected to kind of this work environment, to this organization, of what's kind of necessary to be successful in an organization or in particular roles within an organization, right? So again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with having one personality trait over another, but it is, in terms of becoming more self-aware, it is important to recognize where you fall in these different areas, because it might lead you to a particular field over another, right? So for example, on this idea of extroversion, if I'm highly extroverted, then I gain that energy from interacting with other people. Right. So I enjoy those types of interactions, being around others. That salesperson type of job would be ideal for someone who's more of this extrovert, because again, that's how they gain their energy. If I fall on the other end of that continuum and more of an introvert, it's not saying that I don't like interaction with other people or those social environments, but I need that alone time, right? That introvert needs to have that time by themselves in order to re-energize, right? And it kind of depends on how extreme you are on any of these dimensions to know kind of how much alone time, or maybe you don't really like working with other people because you're kind of that extreme introvert. But again, there's nothing. There's pros and cons to each, obviously, with these different personality traits. So just recognizing where you fall might help lead you to a job that kind of matches your personality, and so you don't have to adjust your personality, but recognizing that it's not a bad thing if you're an introvert or an extrovert, or this idea of agreeableness, or if you're on the other end of that. They all have their pros and cons, and they all get interpreted kind of differently depending on kind of where you fall. For example, if we look back at this idea of extroversion, if I'm highly extroverted, then sometimes if I am talking with, or if I know someone and they're more of an introvert, and I don't like assess somebody, I don't look at them and say, oh, they must be an introvert. If I look at someone and they're not outgoing, and they're not willing to, have these conversations or start a conversation, as an extrovert, which I am not, but if I'm an extrovert, I might look at that person and say, wow, they're kind of snobby, or they're really kind of self-absorbed. They don't even care. They're not even willing to come over and talk to anybody else. When in reality, they're just shy, or they're very anxious in those situations because of that, more of it, them being more of an introvert. And so we want to be aware of the differences here again, so we don't place judgment on other people. Just because they're not like us doesn't mean that that's a negative thing, right? We don't want to place judgment on them and assume that they're snobby or they're self-absorbed or whatever it might be. All right, and so that becomes a big point of becoming more self-aware, is not only understanding kind of where you fall, but recognizing what are the other possibilities and recognizing that someone else might fall, differently, and that's fine. It's still great things that come from those differences. So that's really kind of this idea of extroversion. Agreeableness is this idea of being compassionate, being understanding. All right, where if I'm on the other end of that continuum, I might be more likely to challenge other people's ideas and look like I'm kind of creating conflict in those situations, which again, depending on how it depends on how we interpret those things. But maybe someone who's not agreeable, sometimes that's a good thing. Someone who's going to play that devil advocate and be willing to question and challenge things, it helps us think differently, helps us kind of push other people. And so maybe we need that dynamic. This idea of conscientiousness is looking at people that are kind of maybe more structured, more self-disciplined. If you're highly conscientious, struggling there. So that very organized would be some descriptors of those that fall into kind of that extreme. On the other side, you might interpret someone that's low in this area as being more flexible, more, willing to, change their path, if something comes up, or people might also interpret that low score as being sloppy, being unorganized. So again, just depending, usually those misinterpretations happen from people from the opposite end, right? So we interpret our personality trait as very positive, and then when someone's different from us, sometimes we attribute the negative interpretation to them when there are a lot of positives to that personality trait as well. Neuroticism is looking at kind of the extent to kind of having a pessimistic attitude, being very negative in our interpretation of things, maybe not being able to control our emotions as well, where kind of on the other end, someone who has a low score here would be able to recognize their emotions and be able to control their emotions, are more positive in general, given different situations. And then the last one is this idea of openness. So being, again, just open, being willing to think differently. People that are high on openness are more creative and, again, more willing to try new things. People low on this particular dimension are more kind of data driven, and they have more of that type of kind of mindset than this more creative kind of outlook. So again, there's a lot of free assessments out there that you can take to just give you an idea of kind of where you fall on these different dimensions, to see kind of some of these personality traits that you might have that are kind of connected more to kind of this organizational type of setting. And again, just to recognize what your preferences are, I guess, in terms of personality, but also a big point too would be to recognize that there are differences and interpreting those differences positively and not just kind of attributing the negative aspects to those people that are opposite of us. And so that kind of leads us to our overall core self-evaluation. And so our core self-evaluation is looking at how we appraise ourselves, the world, others. It's this kind of overall positive self-regard that we have for ourselves. There's 4 components that make up our core self-evaluation. Self-esteem, just kind of recognizing kind of how we feel about ourselves, the extent that we feel worthy, that we feel kind of capable in general. Really looks at kind of our self-esteem. Generalized self-efficacy is recognizing or looking at the extent that we feel that we're capable in specific circumstances, all right, how capable we are in kind of different or various circumstances that we might be presented with. Again, neuroticism is looking at kind of our emotional stability or lack of stability, our pessimistic versus optimistic outlook, and then our locus of control, which we've talked about in terms of, how the extent that we feel like we're in control of our future or what happens. All right, so when we look at our overall core self-evaluation, we're trying to kind of assess how we fall in these different areas, all right, to recognize that if we have this overall positive self-regard for ourselves, right, and so the combination of those 4 factors gives us kind of this overall positive or negative self-regard. But if we have this positive self-regard about ourselves, what does that mean? What does that lead to for us? And so you can see some of the outcomes of that is we have higher job satisfaction, we have better job performance, we're just happier in life. And so it's important to recognize ourself, right? These components that make us who we are, so we can either choose to do something about it, right, and adjust if we feel necessary, or to place ourselves in situations that match who we are. All right, so those are kind of some key things that we want to definitely take away from chapter 1. Right. So overall, through the different lectures that you've listened to up to this point, we've talked about the different areas of self-awareness, and you can see kind of the recognizing where we fall in these different areas can really help us lead to better self-understanding and therefore self-management, help us be more effective and satisfied in the roles that we hold or shoot for in kind of an organizational setting. And another equally important factor is that it helps us understand those differences in others. So again, just to kind of wrap up and kind of highlight some of the behavioral guidelines and things that you should have taken away from chapter 1 is identifying kind of what that sensitivity line is and how to, what you can do to maybe prevent that defensiveness, recognizing that, our cultural dimensions are different than other cultures, and, understanding those differences and those similarities that we might have with others from other cultures. Identifying your principles, your values as a base of your behavior and your decision making can help lead to better decision making, especially when you're confronted with ethical and moral kind of situations. Understanding how to expand your cognitive style, your tolerance for ambiguity in these kind of unclear situations, and your locus of control. All right, looking to see kind of where you fall right now and how can I expand that. When we talk about our emotional intelligence, something to take away is kind of recognizing obviously where you are right now within your emotional intelligence and how can I enhance that? How can I get better at controlling my own emotions and also being able to recognize and respond appropriately to other emotions. Developing your core self-evaluation by capitalizing on strengths and accomplishments. Right, this becomes a really important factor when we look at kind of what our strengths are. And again, putting us into our situations where we can really emphasize those strengths, okay, and really thrive in those circumstances. Right, but first I got to recognize what those strengths are, right? And so that's part of the self-awareness. The last two, engage in honest self-disclosure, is a tool to help us, again, continue to become more self-aware and learn more about ourselves through that self-disclosure, and keep a journal for self-analysis, right? Journaling and reflecting are, again, good tools to help us to continue to learn about ourselves and to grow and to change in the areas that we wish to make adjustments in. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed self-awareness, and I hope you are more self-aware as you end this chapter, and I hope you're encouraged to continue to kind of follow these things, or to do these things, because as we gain more experiences, as we do different things, we'll have opportunities to continue to grow, to continue to become more self-aware, and reflect on those experiences. So I hope you continue to think about those experiences in that way. All right, I'll see you later.